Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. On December 31st of 2011, President Barack Obama gave us all his version of a New Year's present. He signed the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. Now, there has been a lot of controversy about this act, particularly with regard to sections 1021 and 1022, which have been construed to authorize the indefinite detention of terrorism suspects without charge or trial, which could include American citizens. President Obama has signed this bill, and even though he has expressed serious reservations in his signing statement and said that he will not, while his administration is in power, authorize the indefinite detention of American citizens, Obama has a certain track record to contend with. When he was running for president, he promised that when he assumed office, U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Iraq. Well, he promised that it would happen pretty much right away. What actually happened was it dragged on until the end of 2011. Even then, he withdrew U.S. troops reluctantly, and only because the Iraqi government would no longer grant those troops immunity from liability. And even then, the United States maintains a sizable presence of about 16,000 diplomats, contractors, and auxiliary staff. So Obama did not do very well in fulfilling that promise. Let's look at some other promises he has made. He has promised that he would shut down the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, which we now know to be the site of extensive and unconscionable tortures of many people who even could not plausibly be connected to terrorist activity. Well, Guantanamo Bay is still open, and the people there are still engaging in their travesties. In fact, there have been numerous other sites, the so-called CIA black sites, which are outside of any U.S. jurisdiction, where even greater atrocities take place under this administration. What else did Obama promise? Obama promised that he would essentially turn his head the other way when states legalized medical marijuana and permitted dispensaries for medical marijuana to function pursuant to state laws. Well, what has been happening recently in states like California and Washington and Montana, which have legalized medical marijuana? Dispensaries that have fully complied with state laws are being raided by federal authorities. Some honesty there in keeping that promise. Or what about his promise to restore a measure of civil liberties to the United States after the warrantless wiretapping of the Bush administration? Well, what Obama has been doing with the TSA, and now in signing these provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act, makes the warrantless wiretapping of the Bush administration seem rather tame and rather gentle by comparison. So, I don't trust Obama at all in fulfilling his promise that his administration will not indefinitely detain U.S. citizens. He doesn't have a good track record of keeping those promises. But even more than that, even if Obama did keep his promise, what about the next administration? What if Newt Gingrich were elected president? Do you think he would balk at indefinitely detaining American citizens? This is a man who has expressed in public his desire to have all drug dealers summarily executed as a way of escalating the perverse drug war that the U.S. government runs. I definitely do not think that that is a sufficient safeguard to protect liberty. There's another point that ought to be emphasized. In an effort to mollify people who expressed concerns about the NDAA, an amendment was inserted stating that nothing in the indefinite detention provisions shall be construed to affect current law regarding the detention of U.S. citizens or lawful resident aliens on U.S. soil. Well, one might think that that's an assurance, but in fact, it kind of bypasses the entire point, and that is the law in its existing form is very unclear. In fact, the Bush administration, and even the Obama administration to a certain extent, has construed the authorization of the use of military force that was issued on September 14th, 2001 by Congress to be quite expansive. In the past, indefinite detentions like that of Jose Padilla, who is an American citizen, who was suspected of essentially orchestrating a dirty bomb attack or a nuclear attack on the United States, he was held indefinitely until about 2008 when he was finally transferred to civilian authorities and put on trial. But the authorization for the use of military force was used by the Bush administration to justify his indefinite detention. That interpretation, though, back then was disputed, and it still is disputed by organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union. So what this NDAA would actually do is it would favor, through the language of the law, one particular interpretation, a very expansive interpretation of prior law. Previously, this was murky territory, and it was essentially up to the courts to decide what was or was not authorized under then existing law. Well, now Congress has essentially passed a bill clarifying what previously existing law is, quote, supposed to mean, and clarifying it in a way that is hostile to the liberties of American citizens and others who may be suspected of terrorism, but for whom there may be no legitimate evidence that they're actually involved in terrorist activities. Indeed, the bill is quite broad as to what activities would qualify for indefinite detention. It's not just being a part of Al-Qaeda or providing material support to Al-Qaeda. It's any kind of substantial affiliation, whatever that means. It leaves it very open and very broad. And I think with certain trends that have been happening recently, that is extremely dangerous. The term terrorist, as it is used by many Western governments, no longer just means Islamic fundamentalist fanatics who want to blow up buildings and kill innocent civilians. Obviously, that's a loathsome and detestable activity. The label terrorist has been applied by certain politicians to WikiLeaks and Bradley Manning. Or, more recently, in Britain, Occupy protesters have been classified as terrorists by the British government. So these are individuals who haven't killed anyone, who don't want to kill anyone. One may dispute whether their particular actions are right or wrong, but they clearly don't fall under the label of combatants. They clearly don't fall under the label of military threats to be dealt with by either mandatory military detention if they're not U.S. citizens, or optional military detention if they are U.S. citizens. The NDAA also embodies a bizarre premise that the United States federal government has frequently acted on, but it has completely no authority and no jurisdiction to act on it, and that is the presumption that the U.S. federal government can send its agents, whether they be military or CIA, anywhere in the world, to detain a terror suspect, even if that person is not an American citizen, is not affiliated with the United States, is not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. government in any way. And if there is anything that loudly screams global policeman, this is it. By what right does the United States federal government have the authority to use military force against someone who hasn't necessarily, provably, engaged in hostilities against Americans anywhere in the world? While I think it's good that at least some leniency, some safeguards have been put in place for U.S. citizens, insufficient ones, but I'll take whatever I can get, there's still this bizarre idea that if someone is not a U.S. citizen, then that person has absolutely no rights and absolutely no protections vis-a-vis the U.S. federal government. I think logic and reason dictate the opposite. If a person is not a U.S. citizen, the U.S. federal government should not be able to touch that person without receiving authorization from the government of which that person is a citizen. Clearly, think about it this way. If there's a person in France who holds certain ideas, and maybe they may be repugnant ideas, maybe they may be ideas that are in some way sympathetic to Al-Qaeda or another terrorist organization, why in the world should the United States federal government have the right to send its agents into France, take that person, indefinitely detain that person in some part of the world, probably outside of U.S. jurisdiction as the NDAA authorizes it, essentially maybe send that person to Guantanamo or to a black site in Afghanistan, completely unrelated to any place that person has ever been. And the French government is considered to have no ability to have a say about this, to have no ability to protest. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. So it's very clear that the NDAA embodies, in many ways, the worst impulses of the American political culture today. First of all, I think it's perpetuating a very expansive legal interpretation of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. Second, it perpetuates this bizarre premise that the United States federal government has absolute unconditional power of life or death, or freedom or unfreedom, over non-U.S. citizens who aren't subject to any U.S. jurisdiction. Third, it gives Barack Obama yet another opportunity to break a major promise, as he has shown indeed quite eager to do. And fourth, of course, it puts potentially anybody in jeopardy because of the very broad language that essentially defines what a terror suspect would be. Think about it this way. If in public discourse today, somebody who partakes in an Occupy protest, maybe completely peacefully, could be classified as a terrorist, then who else might be? Could a substantial affiliation with a terrorist organization be considered the expression of ideas that show similar dislikes to what some of the terrorists dislike? So, for instance, Osama bin Laden has, in many of his videos, condemned U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. What if someone else, completely unrelated to Osama bin Laden, expresses opposition to U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia without any hint of Islamic fundamentalism, without any hint of militarism, without any hint of designs to attack Americans or undermine the U.S. military in practice? What if someone just expresses an opinion? Would that be enough? Would that be a sufficient similarity to Al-Qaeda just because bin Laden said it before? Would that be enough to get that person whisked away in the middle of the night and indefinitely detained, either by the military or, if he's a U.S. citizen, on U.S. soil? So, clearly, that's a very worrisome possibility. Here's another problem. In this NDAA, which is a package bill, among other things, it reauthorized funding for the U.S. military for fiscal year 2012. That's actually one of the reasons why Obama didn't feel like he could veto it, despite his alleged serious reservations. But many things were packaged into it. Another part that was packaged into it was a set of very serious sanctions against Iran, essentially penalizing any country that would accept imports of Iranian oil. If history has taught us anything, it's that this is how wars start. Physical wars, wars of people against people, bombing campaigns, whatever form they may take, very frequently begin as trade wars. Before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the US and Japan engaged in a round of protectionist restrictions, with each country imposing tariffs and sanctions on the other, until essentially both were economically cut off from one another, and it was much easier for them to attack each other. Much less would be at stake if trade had already been severed. And furthermore, the Japanese were rightly frustrated that the United States was essentially, through these sanctions, attempting to cripple their economy. I think U.S. involvement in World War II and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor could have been entirely avoided had the United States not imposed these sanctions and other protectionist measures against Japan in the years leading up to the Pearl Harbor attack. So it's very unfortunate, but all these sanctions are going to do will be to further embitter Iran, to further make the Iranian regime feel insecure about its economic position, to feel embattled by the US and any allies of the United States that are afraid of an economic crackdown by the US if they continue to accept Iranian imports. So all that's going to do is essentially escalate the tensions between the United States and Iran, which is extremely worrisome to me, because compared to any war with Iran, even the recent Iraq war was a cakewalk. Any war with Iran is going to lead to tremendously greater casualties on both sides, both American troops and Iranian civilians who will die in the hundreds of thousands and even the millions. And the great tragedy of that is that among the civilian populations of the Middle East, the Iranian population is overwhelmingly pro-Western because of the demographics. It's overwhelmingly young. It overwhelmingly resents the theocracy that it is under. But what history has shown time and again is, in a time of war, even a population that suffers under a tyrannical regime and despises that regime is going to nonetheless rally around that regime to resist a perceived invader. And the United States will definitely be perceived as an invader. The people who right now sympathize with American culture, if not American policy, are going to see their children blown to bits, and they're going to very quickly change their minds. That will be the consequence of the series of escalations of which these sanctions on Iran are definitely one significant step. So, nothing good is going to come out of this legislation. One can hope that Barack Obama keeps his promise. I'm certainly not rooting for him to break it just to show how much of a promise breaker he is. However, I don't have much confidence in him. I think the only politician right now who is capable of reversing the perilous course that the United States is on is Ron Paul. Ron Paul, who has repeatedly spoken out against indefinite detention of U.S. citizens and others, who has repeatedly spoken out for a measured foreign policy, a foreign policy that allows the United States the possibility to defend its own citizens and the possibility to take out people who really have engaged in acts of terrorism, but who also recognizes that the war on terror has been perverted, and it has been taken past any reasonable extent. It is more than 10 years after the September 11th terrorist attacks of 2001. Bin Laden has been killed. Al-Qaeda is in shambles. Every person who participated in that bombing is now dead or in prison. I think all very deserved punishments for these individuals, because any enemy of Western civilization is an enemy of mine. However, it is time to end this unconscionable use and abuse of military powers in what is essentially a time of peace, when Congress has not officially declared a war in the way that Congress is supposed to. This war on terror is just an interminable, quote, war against an abstraction that very few politicians have the courage to end, because what are they going to say? Are they going to declare peace with terror? The whole concept needs to be jettisoned, and instead there needs to be a more restrained foreign policy that focuses on specific objectives. Specific objectives would have included taking out Osama bin Laden, would have included capturing or killing any of the terrorists who were specifically responsible and could be proven to be specifically responsible for the September 11th attacks. But for too long now, the United States has greatly overreached and has engaged in tremendous killing and destruction in order to essentially salvage its national prestige. Well, I don't know what perverse vision of prestige this is, but it's definitely not worth it. Far more people have been killed as a result of this misguided war on terror than died in the September 11th attacks. It's time to stop. It's time to curtail that damage, and it's time to elect someone who will actually reverse course. Thank you very much.